And I turn it over now to my colleague, Dr. Scott Counts.
Yeah, so we've been doing this for about 10 years now, which is crazy. I was actually laughing to myself on the way down when I first started working with all of you. My hair wasn't gray, turning gray. And now I'm even noticing a little bit coming in over there on Dr. Atkin as well. Yeah. So it's always enjoy this event. You guys are, I've said this in a different way every time probably, but the gist is that, you're just exhibit A on how to develop and create a dementia-friendly community. And I always toot your horn every chance I get when I'm in other communities or talking to other folks about, how it should be done. And I direct them to you guys. So one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, because each year we're trying to come up with new things to discuss. And this year marked the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Nun Study. Anybody heard of the Nun Study? Does that ring a bell with some people? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you all about it, so, whatever. And I've always been fascinated with this study. It's had a profound impact on what we know about risk factors for Alzheimer's. And so I'm just going to kind of walk down memory lane with you a little bit and just sort of point out all the findings that we have. Our knowledge base for Alzheimer's is now better because of the altruism of these nuns. Okay, and Graham mentioned get in touch with us whenever you want if you have any questions. That's my email right there. If you don't have a pen or anything like that, just send Ann a note or Sherry, and they can get in touch with us. So you can find us. Don't worry. What's the Nun Study and why is it important? Now we're back on track. So the Nun Study was the first ever longitudinal, and we'll talk a bit about what that means, clinical pathological cohort of aging and dementia. It started with one convent in Mankato, Minnesota, and then it branched out to about like 50 convents mainly across the Midwest, and so they ultimately had 678 of these nuns enrolled. None of them are alive anymore, okay, so because it was started back in 1985 and they were already elderly when they entered the study. So this was 40 years ago, right? And so it was started, like I said, in 1985 by an epidemiologist and who's actually raised on a chicken farm in California. His name was David Snowden. But he was trying to figure out some way to study healthy aging. And somehow he became involved with, he met someone who was involved with the School Sisters of Notre Dame in Mankato. And as a chicken farmer, he knew that the health of the herd or the health of the flock was important. And one of the ways that you were always able to sort of figure out what was wrong with your flock was because all the chickens were the same. They were very homogeneous, right? There wasn't much variability. So it was easy to pinpoint what the problem was, right? And so what he thought about his sort of transfer of idea there to this population of nuns is that because they all lived in the same place, they ate the same diet, they had the same activities, they would be more homogeneous to try and understand things that increase your risk for, are they're involved in healthy aging. And so it reduces what we call these confounding variables. So in other words, if we want to figure out what's a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and we take 100 of us, well, we're all so different. It's going to be a lot harder to kind of figure out exactly what's a risk factor and what's not, right? Whereas if we're all fairly close to being the same, even though obviously our makeup as humans is much different. But again, we have sort of these same, we live in the same area, we eat the same food, we're doing the same things. That reduces those variables, so it's a little bit easier to pinpoint these things, okay? But so his light bulb moment actually came right around this time. So the mid-'80s was when Alzheimer's disease really started catching steam. People started to recognize it as a disease entity that needed to be researched, okay? And so what he noticed was that these sisters in this convent lived to be very old, and they were still sharp as a tack, most of them, right? And they had very little dementia generally. And so that he shifted his focus from just healthy aging to brain aging, right? And in the mid-'80s, really no one knows anything about risk factors for dementia. No one, it's just, you see it becoming prevalent in society because people are living longer, right? Because age is the biggest risk factor. But again, not a lot of people understand. People didn't even really know what the pathology of the brains look like other than some reports from 80 years earlier, 70 years earlier, right? It just wasn't very well studied. And the masterstroke here was when he was recruited to the University of Kentucky by a pretty famous, now deceased neuropathologist named Bill Marksbury. And Dr. Marksbury convinced him to say, go back to these nuns and see if they'll donate their brains. And he went back to them and they were like, sure, let's do it. So there you go. So now he had these people who were willing to be studied, but then they were also willing to donate their brains when they died. And this is the first cohort of people that were ever brought together to do this type of study, and it was groundbreaking. And again, by longitudinal, what we mean was that each year the nuns went through a whole workup of, they took different cognitive tests. We'll see some of these tests. They had a neurologist evaluate them. And then again, they had signed a brain donation certificate, so they willingly donated their brain. So I think their motto was something like, souls to heaven, brains to science, right? Today, there are at least 35 of these large-scale longitudinal cohorts. So again, this was sort of the first one, and this is what, in fact, and I've mentioned some of these studies before. So the human tissue postmortem studies that we do are usually with people from the Rush Religious Order study. It's not just nuns, but it's also priests and brothers, and there's a lot of them, and it's run by Rush Medical Center, Chicago. And it was just a total copycat study of the nun study. They just added in some male subjects as well, which again diversified the population. That's when it also helped us to understand that there are some male-female differences in risk for AD and things like that. Okay, so ready for our little movie here?
The School Sisters of Notre Dame Mankato is one of 5 SSND provincial homes across the United States and the original home base of the nun study. Most of the sisters who live at the province, called Good Counsel, return after a life of mission work. But their mission is not over. The fact is, sisters never really retire.
Obviously, the School Sisters of Notre Dame have a long history of being educators, so their desire was to be able to educate in death as well as in life.
It's not exactly the setting you'd have in mind for a groundbreaking research study.
Well, personally, I feel rather privileged in a way, maybe honored to a certain degree, that I am able to participate in this study.
One of our 96-year-olds said recently, I just wish they'd ask me different questions every year. So I think it gives you a clue of what kind of shape her brain is in.
Even by the time the sisters retire, many are in extraordinarily good shape. They volunteer, teach, and participate in art activities. In short, they keep themselves busy. It reinforces the nun study's original finding. Lifestyle plays a role in healthy cognitive functioning.
It's endless of what could happen, and we feel like we're just making one little tiny contribution in that, and yet it could be a significant contribution.
I always say, well, if they're really doing something with the brain, I'm going to go to heaven brainless.
Okay, so let's go into some of their findings. The first finding, and this came out, again, like about 30 years ago, and I remember I just started graduate school, and this made a huge splash. But what happened was Dr. Snowden was just messing around with some filing cabinets and actually came across the personal records of the nuns in this particular order. And what happened was they were required to write an autobiography before they entered or took their vows and entered the order. And it turns out that the nuns at all these other convents were also required to do the same thing. So he had all these autobiographies of everyone, okay, that were written when they were in their late teens, early 20s, okay, so a long time ago. And so he started working with this psychologist named Sue Kemper, who is at the University of Kansas, and she had developed these two constructs, if you will. One was called idea density, or the number of discrete ideas per 10 written words. And so she'd established this was a good marker for just educational attainment, education, general knowledge. And then she came up with another construct called grammatical complexity. And that was a good marker for memory function. Okay, and so what he found was that the elderly sisters who showed signs of Alzheimer's disease had consistently authored essays that were low in idea density and grammatical complexity a half century earlier. Okay, so this is one of the first findings that early life education, which I believe Sherry had mentioned, all the programs that start from sort of early life to late life, right? Is a protective, seems to be protective for developing dementia much later in life. And so just some examples of this. And so this was Sister A. She said, I was born in Eau Claire, 1913, baptized at St. James. So this had an idea density of 3.9 and a grammatical complexity of 0. Okay, and then Sister B was, the happiest day of my life was First Communion, June 19th, 1920, hello. And when I was 8 years old, 4 years later, the same month, I was confirmed by Bishop D.D. McGavick. And so this was given an idea density of 8.6 and grammatical complexity of 7. And so what they saw then was, but we'll just take a look at idea density here first. So these are all the sort of cognitive tests that they would take every year, okay? And so they're mainly memory tests, testing different aspects of your memory, okay? And so the percent of people who did poorly on these memory tests that had the low idea density, that percentage of people doing poorly was much higher than the percentage of people who had the high idea density. Okay, same thing with the grammatical complexity. So for all these tests, the people with low grammatical complexity, there's a much greater percentage of those who are performing poorly on these memory tests as opposed to the people with the high grammatical complexity. And then this was the kicker. They went and looked at the brains of these folks after they had passed. And what they found was that, and I believe Professor Brainy told us a little bit about this, but whether it's the temporal lobe or the parietal lobe or the frontal lobe and the subiculum and CA1, those are parts of that hippocampus that Professor Brainy was talking about, okay? What they found was that the people with the low idea density actually tend to have more tangles and the neurofibrillary tangles that we talked about in all these areas of the brain compared to the people with the high idea density, right? So again, not only did it seem to be this early educational attainment seemed to be protective against, just cognitive decline later in life, but also protective against the actual pathology, which is so that was just, again, we know this sort of somewhat as a matter of fact now, but it was groundbreaking at the time. Okay, so some more fun little stories here, and it's interesting when you hear when I was starting to study this in more detail. What I found was that typically there would be one of the sisters who would make this observation, and then they go back and study everyone else and make this huge finding. Okay. And so Sister Mary and cognitive resilience, and we'll talk about what that is. So again, Sister Mary, this is her right there, okay? She had superior cognitive function until her death at 101, so she stayed sharp till she died. But when on autopsy, her brain showed that she had lots of plaques and tangles in them, right? So this led to the concept of cognitive resilience, okay? So in other words, the ability to maintain good cognitive function even though you've got pathology in your brain, okay? And her lifestyle seemed to matter, right? So she was a full-time teacher for 50 years, part-time until 84. She was a math teacher. She always took summer courses, so she was a lifelong learner. So not only did she have early educational attainment and was teaching, but she was also a lifelong learner. And she stayed active in her retirement. She read, she wrote things. She did this thing that she called praying around the globe, where she would go and learn about a new culture. somewhere in another country, and then she would say prayers for the needy in that country, things like this. So she was constantly sort of learning about different cultures. And also she was a bit of a social butterfly and would organize these events. And she was remembered for, eyes that radiated joy and her positive attitude and a big laugh, right? And so we know that all these things represent factors that can reduce your risk, right? Education, lifelong learning, staying social and engaged, and then also just a positive mental attitude can go a long way, right? Sometimes easier said than done, right? But we can always strive. And so what was interesting about Sister Mary was that, these are those cognitive tests. And so the mini mental state exam, that's like a global cognitive function. It's based, someone here may have actually taken this test. But it's 30 questions. And so a score of 30 is perfect and a score of 0 is really, it's the worst, right? And so even though she was 100, at 101, she was still scoring a 27, so she was still way up there. Based on other nuns, her age, her predicted score would have been 4. Okay, so she had all that, and so you sort of see the pattern here with all these other tests. So just scoring better, higher scores are better than she was predicted to. But then when they looked at her brain, they actually saw that she actually did, again, have like more of the tangles in the hippocampus than was predicted, as well as the plaques in other areas of the brain, and her brain weighed less than was predicted. So again, she was just an example of cognitive resilience. And now we know this is a pretty common well-accepted theme. So here's a study, again from Rush. This is not the religious order study. This is their community-based cohort called the Memory and Aging Project. But what they did is they measured mental activity in this, again, longitudinal cohort that again, the nun study sort of started that whole idea, right? And so they looked at activities like reading and writing and playing cards and puzzles and all these things. And they collected this data over the course of 8 years on 2,000 participants, right? So now these cohorts have gotten really big. And they were at average age of 80, and when they started looking at them, they had no dementia. So the people with the highest levels of mental activity developed dementia at 94. And the people with the lowest levels of mental activity developed dementia at 86, right? So again, there's this protective factor for staying engaged and involved and sort of, working the brain, right? But what was interesting is that of these 2,000 or so, about 700 actually came to autopsy, and again, they're doing the brain donations, and they found that the level of mental activity had no effect on the amount of plaques and tangles in their brain. So these people, didn't matter how many plaques and tangles they had, they were still able to maintain a higher level of resilience and not develop dementia until their 90s instead of into their 80s, right? So that was a really cool study, and just an example of how, once again, finding from the nun study leads to other people doing these other studies, and then now we've got this sort of established concept for the field about cognitive resilience. And again, when we find people with cognitive resilience and study their brains, we may be able to discover some protective factor that they have that can be harnessed as a therapy. So like Graham was saying, it's not, we know now that amyloid therapies aren't the end all, right? It's probably going to be some cocktail of different types of drugs. And those cocktails could maybe just, could include therapies that come from studying people with brain resilience. The next example is Sister Mattia, I guess. And VCID stands for Vascular Contributions to Cognitive Impairment and Dementia. So Professor Brainy talked a little bit about that. Sydney talked a little bit about it as well, protecting your brain, but through protecting your vascular system. But Sister Mattia had superior cognitive function until, this is a picture of her, until she was 103. And then within 1 year, she became demented and died. Okay, and so on autopsy, her brain revealed lots of plaques and tangles. So again, at 103, she was resilient. She had all these plaques and tangles, but she was still, doing well on these cognitive tests and all that. But what they found was evidence of new strokes, ischemic strokes and a hemorrhagic stroke or a brain bleed, right? And she also had moderate atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries in the brain. Okay, and so they went back and they looked at all the other brains and from all these other nuns who had come before Sister Mattia, and what they found was that the sisters who died of the sisters who died with dementia, those that had both Alzheimer's pathology or the plaques and tangles plus the vascular pathology were significantly more impaired when they were alive. Okay, and so this was the first clue to the importance of vascular contributions. Okay, and so they actually found that 34% of the nuns had died with Alzheimer's plus these vascular contributions, like strokes and things. And I will get to the other co-pathology here in a second, but just to give you an example. And again, this is from a study, actually a friend of mine back at Rush, Zoe Arvanatakis. This is about 15 or so years ago. But what she looked at was, so this is people with increasing Alzheimer's pathology, right? So this is low pathology, high pathology. And these are people, and so this is your probability of dementia. So high probability, low probability. Okay, and so what we see is that, like, for say the same amount of Alzheimer's disease pathology, right, going up here, so whatever this number is, the number's too small to see. So people with no strokes, their probability was fairly low. So I think this is right around 40%, right? If they had large strokes, their probability of dementia had gone up to about 60%. And then if they had large and small strokes, their probability had gone up to about 70%. Okay, so again, just the additive effects of the vascular pathology onto the Alzheimer's pathology. And again, we know this now, we recognize it, this VCID as a heavily studied field in Alzheimer's research, but it all started with Sister Mattia, right? It's pretty cool. And then the other thing they found, though, when they were looking at all these other brains, and this was with Dr. Marksbury down at Kentucky, what they found was that 20% of the nuns with dementia had Alzheimer's disease plus non-Alzheimer's disease type pathologies like the Lewy bodies, right? And so that really sort of changed our thoughts about the things that cause dementia, right? We used to think of a thing, and I'll show you sort of a graph of this, but we used to think it was just like a real clean plaques and tangles, but a lot of people come to autopsy with plaques, tangles, and other types of pathology, and this is now generally recognized. And again, studying co-pathologies and the effect that these pathologies have on each other is also another big hot topic in the field. But I'll just show you, I've showed this slide before, it was a few years ago, but so we now know that the link between vascular contributions to dementia that risk can be reduced by, of course, taking care of your heart, right? And keeping your vascular system strong. So this was the SPRINT study. They had 9,300 people who were hypertensive. They didn't have a history of diabetes or dementia or stroke, okay? But they either got the intensive care, you can see here, which kept their, that top number, like the, 120 over 80 or whatever they want you to have, right? So they kept that top number down below 120, and then the standard care, they just treated it to keep it below 140. Okay, and what they found, if you look at the last bullet point here, is that there was a significant reduction in the risk of developing mild cognitive impairment or dementia in that intensive strategy. And so this was the strongest link to date, evidence to date linking treatment of high blood pressure and taking care of your vascular, health and reducing dementia risk. Okay, and I'll just skip this except to say that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So they're holding hands, so that's good. So getting back to the co-pathologies, our traditional view of dementia was that, it's either caused by Alzheimer's, or it's caused by vascular, or it's caused by Lewy bodies, or it's caused by frontotemporal degeneration, which it can involve some other types of pathologies in the brain. But now we know of it more as, can't even remember what that said now, but this is sort of our new view of how this really works. The real picture is more complicated, right? You have multiple pathologies, often seen in the same person. And so, again, this complicates diagnosis and therapy, right? And so that's why it's become such an important field to study, because it's now recognized that this is, most people have these multiple pathologies, and so just treating, like I said, just treating the plaques probably isn't gonna cut it, right? And again, the cerebrovascular pathology is the main pathology that you see overlapping with all these other main sort of what we would call neurodegenerative diseases, okay? Okay, a couple more. I think I'm almost done here. Yep, okay, cool. Sister Marcella, okay, so this is actually a similar concept, okay, to resilience, but this is now we're talking about resistance, like, and the concept of the oldest old who just become what we call super agers, okay, and this is like a big, there's a big cohort of these super agers that they're studying at Northwestern and out in California. Because they're able to look at their brains with the PET scans and see that they don't have a lot of the plaques or tangles, but they're really old, and by this time they should have some. Okay, but anyway, Sister Marcella, there weren't any real. There wasn't any real like data to show on this. It was just more of a story, but I thought it was a cool story, so I decided to tell it. So she died at 101, delightful sense of humor, blessed with a remarkable memory, told wonderful stories. You know, she said, I've lived an ordinary life, I haven't really done anything special, but people who knew her saw her as anything but ordinary. Because her life and cognitive abilities and longevity were extraordinary. And so in post-mortem evaluation, what they found was that she had a big old brain, 1,280 grams. Remember, Sister Mary was 800 and something, right? So she had a nice big brain, like again, it should have at least, it should have actually weighed less just from just general, even healthy brain aging, your brain shrinks a little bit every year. And so, but hers was just for some reason still big. And she showed almost no signs of any sort of pathology. And interestingly enough, there's only the slightest hint of atherosclerosis in her brain. Okay, and she was described as having a Braak stage of 0. And so that's the classifier they use to basically tell you how many, or tell how many, like what was the load of these neurofibrillary tangles in the brains of these people, right? And so the scale goes from 0 to 6, and she was at a 0. So basically no tangles, and again, she had a remarkably clean, large brain. And so now people are actively researching the brains of these people who seem to be resistant, or these, you know, super agers, because again, these the differences between these folks and say people the same age who become demented, that could also give us new clues for therapies to target protection. So again, there's something about these people, if we could figure out what that is and put it in a bottle, well, there you go. It could be some lightning, right? And then again, Grant talked about ApoE, so I don't need to go into that, except that the NUN study was the first cohort to confirm that the ApoE4 was the main genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So anyway, the point is that they had found this link between ApoE4 and Alzheimer's risk, but they didn't really have a subjects to see, okay, how prevalent is this, and what's the real effect, right? Well, enter the NUN study. So they went back and they did the genotyping, as they call it. So they figured out what everyone's ApoE was. It was a 4 or 2 or 3. 4 is the bad one. 2 is actually a good one. And what they found over here, so this graph right here, so what this is what we call a sort of a survival curve. And so this is the proportion of people who are still alive. So high proportion of people, low proportion of people, right? And this is 5 years of following up on these folks after they figured out what their genetics, their ApoE gene was. And so these are the people without an ApoE4. So their probability of still being alive 5 years later was 70%, whereas the people who had the ApoE4 copy gene, their probability of being alive 5 years later was 40%. Okay, so this is really significantly affecting. And then when they checked on these folks in their last exam, their last cognitive exam before they died, they found that people with the ApoE, 41% were still doing well on the tests, but 47%, almost half, were impaired, and then 12% were demented. Whereas in people with the absence of this ApoE4, 65% were still cognitively doing well, and only 28 were impaired, and only 7 demented. Okay? Okay, so I'll just go to thank you very much. Yeah, that's it.
Access Vision. Your voice, your community.